Hey everyone, today I'm going to be looking at Rage and its gamepad aiming issues. Please forgive the quality of the video. Unfortunately, with OBS running, it seems to create some performance issues with Rage, and it'll probably look even worse recording the video, so the performance snags will probably be make the video look a little grittier than it is. But hopefully I can show everything I'm going to bring up well enough. But getting started, Rage has a very weird dead zone shape. It's sort of a square with its corners cut out. I've taken a bit of liberties with this little arch right here. I'll supply the dot graph below so you can kind of see how I've taken liberties with it. It's a little too precise for me to tell exactly what the shape is. But it's about 20% in a square shape, so these corners require a bit more diagonal movement. And a bit less than you would think, than a square, because of these sort of sections that are cut off. But 20% dead zone is pretty large. It's pretty average for many games, but it's still quite large. As you can see, can make quite a bit of stick movement without anything happening in game. And again, it's not square, but it does share a lot of the issues that square dead zones have, whereas it restricts diagonal movement around the axes. As you can see, I'm bobbing the stick up and down, but I'm moving perfectly left. I can do that over here, perfectly right. I'm putting it at a very obvious angle, and I'm still moving perfectly right. It isn't until you break into this green region where you start seeing diagonal movement occur. It's very obvious when looking straight up or down, because you can use this horizontal way to gauge when the diagonal movement starts. And you see it widens up the further your stick magnitude goes out. And what's really interesting is you can kind of see these little pockets of these blue squares, or blue triangles more specifically, and because these are cardinal movement. As you can see, I'm moving perfectly up, but what's interesting is when I move to the higher version, I'm moving perfectly left, and that happens of course on all of them. So when I'm in the higher of the two, I'm moving perfectly right, but when I'm in the lower of the two, I'm moving perfectly up. Same thing over here. So the lower, I'm moving perfectly down, and I'm moving perfectly right. Oops, this is hard to get exactly, but perfectly right, perfectly down. So that's extremely weird, but it seems to have an effect on the acceleration as well, which I'll get to in just a second. The acceleration curve is actually pretty good, so it starts out pretty slow and then builds up pretty smoothly until its maximum. So there's no real problem with that. However, these little pockets seem to illustrate an issue with diagonal acceleration. You can kind of see how it's sort of changing directions and spiking in different speeds. It's like related to these little corners. The lower portion is a little more vertically biased, but when I go to a higher portion, it's more horizontally biased. And that's pretty interesting. It definitely makes diagonal movement a little more janky, especially when you're hovering around making perfectly diagonal movements. Yeah, as you can see right there, it's a little harder to see when it's capped, but you can kind of see it snagging back and forth way more than it should. Now, additionally, this is kind of a tedious problem, is the vertical sensitivity is slower than the horizontal. And this is, obnoxious, because we do have options to customize it, but as you can see, I have them set the same. But the vertical sensitivity is obviously lower than the horizontal sensitivity. And that just means that the options don't actually relate to the in-game cursor sensitivity, and that's tedious. This also means that if you want to play on max sensitivity, like you prefer having maximum horizontal sensitivity, there is no way to get these the X and Y sensitivity the same at max sensitivity, because the Y is always going to be slower. The only way to get the Y sensitivity, the Y and X sensitivity the same, is to have the Y much in the options much more sensitive than the X. It's just a really unintuitive system, and the option should ideally be correct to how the cursor sensitivity is. Now, my final complaint with Rage is aim smoothing. For those that don't know, aim smoothing is when your turn rate builds up over time. So this is sort of the maximum turn rate you can move. In normal circumstances, if you peg your stick, you'll immediately be going at the sensitivity. But as you can sort of tell, like, the sensitivity starts much lower. So I can make these tiny circles, and I'm pegging the stick fully, but it's making very small circles because the sensitivity hasn't built up anywhere. So it's very slow. It should be making circles like this large, or ovals, since you know the vertical sensitivity is slower. So it'll make more ovular shapes. But since your turn rate builds up over time, it makes it much more difficult to, say, make twitch movements. Like if I wanted to move from this column over here, it's hard to gauge, because it's something you might just like say, I'm going to flip for peg the stick for X amount of time, but like it'll start off slow and then speed up, so it's really hard to adapt to that. And additionally, if you're going to track a target that's, say, like running across this room, you might have picked out the correct tracking speed, but since aim smoothing starts you out slower, you might trail behind them and then match their speed. So it makes it very unintuitive to aim correctly. And I mean, unfortunately, that covers all the issues I have with this. Unfortunately, Rage is well past its time for any support, so these are the kind of issues you're going to be stuck with if you ever play this with a controller. And I'm showing this on the PC version, but this is definitely something that applies to the console version. Now, interestingly, everything I've shown is not so much a Rage specific issue, but an issue with pretty much all id Tech 5 games. You can see this exact dead zone smoothing in Doom BFG edition, in the Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil and Lost Mission games. You can see this in Wolfenstein The New Order. You can see all these issues, and you can see it in what's the last one? The Evil Within. The one exception there is that it's simply larger. So this is about a 20% dead zone. The Evil Within uses closer to a 30% dead zone, which just picture this graph larger. And I'll put a link to the graph so you can kind of compare it. There are some exceptions, because Doom BFG edition on PC actually has standard circle and square dead zones that you can actually choose between, and there are options for aim smoothing. But yeah, Rage is the kind of one that introduced this strange style of dead zone and kind of aim smoothing for the id series. And I mean, the engine can be, you can set up any controls for the engine, but this is something that seems to be a default option, since so many games have used it. But anyway, that's just a little tidbit unrelated to these general issues, but that about covers it. I mean, unfortunately, yeah, it is what it is, and could be better. Hopefully we see better controls in Rage 2. Thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day.